By the time Mara Whitcomb turned off the county road and onto the gravel lane leading to her father's farm, the dust behind her old blue Ford rose so thick it looked like smoke. The truck coughed at the bend by the mailbox, where the white paint had peeled away and the name Witcom had faded almost gray. Behind her, 2 flatbed trailers rattled over the washboard road, stacked with wire cages full of 1,600 quail. The birds fluttered, cried, and beat their small brown wings against the wire. By sunset, half of Riley County had heard about it. A green Dodge slowed beside the fence. Buck Tally sat behind the wheel with a toothpick in his mouth, staring toward the barn like he was watching an accident happen. Beside him, Roy Mercer leaned over the dash and said nothing. Buck farmed 400 acres of soybeans and trusted anything with horsepower. Roy had once run dairy cows, and he had helped carry Mara's father's casket the spring before. That made his silence worse than laughter. The Witcom barn stood behind Mara, with one corner of its tin roof lifted loose from the rafters. The south pasture beyond it was yellow, thin, and chewed down to weeds no cow wanted. Ragweed crowded the fence line. Bare patches of soil had baked hard under the sun. The whole farm looked tired enough to lie down. Mara climbed out in worn gloves and her father's old canvas jacket. She did not wave at Buck or Roy. She did not explain why she had spent nearly the last of her money at a hatchery 2 counties over, buying birds nobody wanted because the place was closing down. She only lowered the tailgate, lifted the first cage, and carried it into the barn. The quail were small enough to fit in a man's hand. Some had missing feathers, some were thin, a few had raw places from crowding and panic. They did not look like livestock that could save a farm. They did not look like cattle, corn, hay, or anything a banker could call security. They looked like a mistake. By the time Mara carried the last cage inside, the barn was filled with a restless, trembling sound. Buck's Dodge idled by the fence for another minute before pulling away. Roy never laughed where she could hear him, but Mara saw him shake his head. She knew what they were thinking. A girl already drowning in debt had just brought home 1,600 more mouths to feed. She did not look back at the road. She stood in the barn doorway after dark, one hand on the old post where her father had carved her height marks when she was little, and listened to the birds rustle beneath the broken roof. Everyone in Riley County would soon call it madness, but Mara had not brought the quail home because she believed in miracles. She had brought them home because she had seen something in that dying land no one else had bothered to notice. Witcom Farm had once been 72 acres of steady work and quiet pride. Her father, Daniel Witcomb, had run cattle on the back pastures and cut hay from the low field near the creek. He had never been rich, but most years the farm paid its bills. In old photographs on the kitchen wall, the grass stood knee-high, the pond held water through August, and Daniel smiled beside a red tractor that still had shine in the paint. By the time Mara inherited the place at 24, almost nothing still shined. Daniel had spent his final 2 years fighting a lung sickness that stole his breath and left him too weak to keep up with the work. The fences leaned, the cattle numbers dropped, the hayfield thinned. 3 dry summers burned the roots out of the south pasture. The pond shrank into a green hole by August. The tractor lost a gear. The barn roof leaked into the loft. The well pump groaned every time it kicked on. After the funeral, Mara found the bank letters in a drawer beneath feed receipts and vet bills. Earl Haskins at First County Bank had known her since she was a girl sitting on the lobby floor with a grape soda while her father signed cattle notes. Earl had gone duck hunting with Daniel twice in the 90s and still kept one faded photograph of them standing knee-deep in marsh grass. That made his pressure worse. Earl did not look at Mara like a stranger trying to take her land. He looked at her like a man who had already grieved the farm and was waiting for her to accept the funeral. The bank wanted proof that Witcom Farm could still produce income before the end of the year. Without it, the land could be foreclosed and sold to the big operation west of town, the same one that had already bought 3 family farms in 5 years. People told Mara to be practical. They said 72 acres was too small to compete anymore. The soil was tired, the fences were bad, and the equipment was older than she was. She could sell before the bank forced her hand, maybe keep the house, maybe walk away with something. Mara listened. Then she went home and walked the fields alone. She noticed beetles under dead grass, bare soil crusted after every rain, grasshoppers rising in clouds from the south pasture, and tick-heavy brush near the fence where cattle no longer grazed clean. She noticed how rainwater ran across the surface instead of sinking in. She noticed how the lowest part of the pasture always lost soil first. The land was not simply poor, it was out of balance. In her father's notebooks, she found the same idea written again and again. Daniel had believed the farm did not need to get bigger to survive, it needed to get smarter. He had clipped articles about soil biology, pasture rotation, composted litter, bird manure, insect pressure, and small livestock systems that could rebuild weak acres one strip at a time. Most of those notes had never become more than notes. Illness took his strength before he could try them. Mara knew she could not buy more cattle. She could not afford fertilizer for the whole farm. She could not repair every fence at once. But she could build smaller. She could rotate. She could sell something different. Then the hatchery called. It was closing after 40 years. The owner had too many quail and not enough buyers. Some were laying birds, some were young, some were stressed, thin, and rough-looking from the shutdown. Mara drove there before dawn with borrowed trailers, cash in an envelope, and her father's notebook on the passenger seat. When she came home with 1,600 quail, the county saw foolishness. Mara saw a system. The laughter started at Bell's Feed and Seed the next morning. Mara walked in for game bird feed, lime, water nipples, wire mesh, and bedding. The talk around the coffee counter sank into silence. Buck Tally stood near the coffee pot. Roy Mercer sat on an overturned mineral bucket by the door. Len Bell, who owned the store and had extended Daniel credit during 2 bad hay years, looked at Mara's order list like the numbers had to be wrong. By noon, people at the diner knew. By evening, Earl Haskins knew. By the end of the week, the county office knew. Some said Mara had bought diseased birds. Some said the barn would stink up the church parking lot by summer. Some said she was trying to sell fancy eggs to city people, as if tiny speckled eggs could save land that had defeated grown men. Mara did not defend herself. Arguments would not patch a roof, pay a feed bill, or keep a bird alive. Before sunrise, she checked the heat lamps. She separated weak birds, cleaned feeders, raked out wet bedding, and logged deaths, feed use, egg count, and water use in a notebook. At night, when the quail settled into a low, restless murmur, she walked the south pasture with a flashlight, marking sections with flags. Earl drove out one afternoon in polished shoes that gathered dust before he reached the barn. He did not step inside for long. The smell was already stronger than Mara wanted, a mix of warm feathers, feed, bedding, and ammonia from a damp corner where the roof still leaked. Earl looked at the cages, the patched cords, the tired rafters, and the stack of bills on the workbench. He was not laughing, he was calculating. Denise Caldwell came next in a white county pickup with mud on the tires and a clipboard under one arm. She was not some city official who had never stepped over a feed sack. Her family had raised hogs north of the river when she was young, and she knew what a badly managed barn could become. She noticed the ammonia before she reached the door. She noticed the drainage ditch before Mara mentioned it. She noticed the wet bedding, weak airflow, improvised wiring, and the way Mara had tried to solve 10 problems with $3 and stubbornness. That made Denise harder to dismiss. She was not there to mock the quail. She was there because if Mara was wrong, the creek would carry her mistake downstream. That night, Mara opened her father's notebook and found a sketch he had drawn years earlier. Low movable pens, pasture strips, compost rows, buffer grass, and arrows showing rotation across tired ground. The quail were never meant to stay crowded in the barn. The barn was only supposed to be the beginning. Daniel had believed small birds could help where large animals had failed, not by magic, but through timing and movement. Their manure could feed soil if spread lightly and rotated often. Their scratching could disturb the surface without tearing it open. Their appetite for small insects could reduce pressure in targeted areas. Their eggs could bring weekly cash long before a calf could be raised and sold. But the system would only work if the birds kept moving. The bedding became compost instead of waste, and the water stayed clean. So Mara began to build. She turned old cattle panels into low pasture pens and covered them with tight wire. She mounted them on skids made from scrap lumber and repaired wheels from broken garden carts. She stretched shade cloth over one half and salvaged tin over the other. The first pens were ugly, crooked, and heavy. Moving them alone took all her strength. She dragged them 10 feet at a time across the south pasture, while the quail skittered inside, pecking at grass seeds, beetles, and tender weeds between bare patches. Behind each pen, the ground looked lightly scratched and dotted with manure. To anyone expecting a miracle, it looked like nothing. Mara was not expecting a miracle. She was looking for increments. She marked each strip on a hand-drawn map. She kept birds on one section only long enough to feed and disturb it, then moved them before manure built too thick. The used bedding went into a compost pile far from the drainage ditch, layered with straw, leaves, and old hay. She planted buffer grass by the ditch, hammered fence posts until her shoulders ached, and cleaned the barn with lime, vinegar, and more patience than money. The first 2 weeks cost her almost 300 birds. Some died from stress, some were already too weak. One storm soaked a brooder corner before she woke. A heat lamp failed in the night. A raccoon tore at a pen and killed 9 birds through the wire. The feed bill climbed faster than the egg count. Belle's feed and seed stopped extending credit. Her hands cracked from washing waterers. Her hair smelled permanently of barn dust. At night, her body hurt so deeply that getting up from the kitchen chair felt like climbing out from under a weight. Still, the notebook kept her steady. Mortality slowed. Egg counts rose. The wet corner dried after she patched the roof with salvaged tin. Ammonia dropped after she cut new vents beneath the eaves. The compost pile heated properly. In the south pasture, the first rotated strips began to soften after rain instead of sealing into crust. Tiny green blades appeared where the earliest pens had passed. No one driving by could see those details. They saw a tired young woman dragging strange boxes across a worn-out pasture, while 1,600 small birds ate feed she could barely afford. Mara saw the first proof. But proof did not pay quickly enough. She packed eggs by hand and drove them to a farmer's market 60 miles away. A chef from a small restaurant bought 6 dozen the second week and 12 dozen the third. A health food shop agreed to try a standing order if Mara could guarantee clean handling and consistent delivery. It was something, but not enough. Then the county letter arrived. It came in a white envelope with the official seal in the corner. Mara opened it at the kitchen table after evening chores. The words were calm, almost polite, but they landed like a hammer. Due to complaints and inspection concerns, the barn operation had to be brought into compliance within 30 days or shut down. The letter listed inadequate ventilation, improper waste storage, unclear permitting, runoff risk near the drainage ditch, and questions about commercial egg handling. At first, Mara read it like a chore list. She underlined phrases with a pencil. She made columns. She circled dates. Then she reached the sentence that said the barn operation could be ordered closed. The pencil rolled out of her hand. For almost an hour, Mara did nothing. The kitchen light buzzed above her. A moth threw itself against the window screen. The farm seemed to go quiet around her, as if even the animals were waiting. She walked to the barn in the dark. Inside, the quail shifted when she opened the door. One weak bird lay near the edge of a feeder, its breathing fast, its eyes half shut. Mara picked it up and held it in both hands. It weighed almost nothing. That was what undid her. Not the bank, not the county seal, not Buck's laugh or Roy's pity. It was the terrible lightness of the thing she had promised to keep alive. 1,600 birds had sounded like a number big enough to change a farm. In her hands, one bird felt like proof that she had built her future out of something too fragile to survive. For one long, honest hour, Mara quit. She quit in her mind. She sold the birds. She signed the bank papers. She watched the big operation west of town tear out her father's fence lines and fold Witcom farm into somebody else's acreage. She imagined the barn scraped flat, the mailbox replaced, and the pasture renamed by people who had never known where Daniel used to stop and listen for bobwhite calls at dusk. Then the bird in her hands moved. It opened one eye and tucked its head against the warmth of her thumb. At dawn, Denise Caldwell's county truck rolled up the lane for a follow-up visit Mara had nearly forgotten. Denise found her outside the barn, hollow-eyed, mud on her jeans, the shutdown letter folded in one hand. Denise looked at the sagging roof, then at the birds, then at Mara. Mara lifted her head and said, "Then don't close the barn. Teach me how to make it worth keeping open." It was the only sentence she had spoken all week. Denise did not answer right away. Something changed in her face. Not mercy exactly, but recognition. She was no longer looking at a stubborn girl hiding a mess. She was looking at someone willing to fix every inch of it if failure was not treated as final. After that morning, Mara worked as if 30 days were all the time she would ever be given. She split the flock into smaller groups. The strongest birds went into mobile pasture pens. The weaker ones stayed only in the sections of barn she could upgrade fastest. She cleared the old tack room and turned it into a clean egg sorting space. She moved compost uphill and away from the drainage path. She set straw bales and grass buffer between the pile and the ditch. She dug shallow swales by hand to slow runoff. At night, she read county rules until the words blurred. She called the state extension office, then a small poultry farmer 3 counties away, then a retired inspector her father had once known. She did not ask anyone to save her. She asked what needed to be fixed, what had to be documented, and how to keep the birds legal without poisoning the creek. People expected a sale sign. Instead, they saw her truck at the hardware store before opening, scrap lumber becoming more pens, grass seeds spread along the ditch, compost thermometers stuck into steaming windrows, and crates washed under a yard light at 10 at night. Then summer turned brutal. For 26 days, no real rain fell. County roads powdered under truck tires. Soybean fields curled at the edges. Pastures faded from green to gray. Grasshoppers rose from ditch banks in dry, clicking waves. Farmers who had mocked Mara's tiny birds began feeding hay in July. On Witcom farm, the south pasture did not become lush overnight. But the rotated strips held differently. The ground beneath the quail pens had a darker cast. When Mara pushed her fingers into it, the top inch broke soft instead of flaking away. New grass in those sections stayed green longer than the untouched pasture. Insects still came, but not in the same thick waves. Denise returned 3 days before the deadline. Mara met her with a binder. Flock numbers, mortality rates, egg handling dates, compost temperatures, pen rotation maps, bedding records, water locations, sales logs, ventilation changes, and photos of the drainage buffer. She did not give a speech. She walked Denise through the barn, then out to the pasture, then along the ditch where new grass had taken root. Denise checked the fans, the egg room, the compost, the mobile pens, and the map showing no group of birds remained in one place long enough to overload the soil. The barn was no longer a crowded gamble. It had become one controlled part of a larger system. The order was not erased that day, but it changed. Mara received conditional approval to continue under a reduced, documented, pasture-rotated operation, while final permit adjustments were processed. The barn did not close. The birds stayed. That should have been the ending, but the land had one more test waiting. The storm that broke the drought did not arrive like relief. It arrived like punishment. All afternoon, the sky lowered over Riley County in a green-gray wall. The air went still enough that even the grasshoppers stopped clicking. Mara felt the pressure in her teeth while she moved the last pasture pen uphill, one shoulder braced against the frame, boots slipping in the powder-dry soil. The quail inside grew restless before the first thunder sounded. They crowded beneath the tin shelter, bodies pressed close, as if they could feel what was coming through the ground. By 5 o'clock the wind hit. It came hard from the west, flattening ragweed and snapping loose tin on the barn roof like gunfire. Dust rose first, then leaves, then cold drops of rain. Mara ran from pen to pen, checking latches, dropping sandbags, pulling shadecloth tight, and hammering loose staples with the side of a hatchet because there was no time to find the right tool. The rain turned violent in less than 3 minutes. Water fell so hard the pasture disappeared behind it. The dry ground, baked shut by weeks of heat, could not drink fast enough. Sheets of brown water slid downhill toward the barn. The drainage ditch filled with a sound like a train. Mara saw one lower pen shift when runoff struck its side. She ran. The quail inside panicked as water curled around the skids. Mara grabbed the tow rope and pulled, but the pen had sunk into sudden mud. The water rose over her ankles. Behind her, the barn lights flickered once, then went out. She dug her heels in and pulled again. The pen lurched 6 inches. She pulled until heat tore across her palm and the rope burned through her glove. The pen moved another foot, then another, just enough for the current to split around it instead of driving straight through. Lightning lit the whole pasture white. For 1 second, Mara saw everything at once: the ditch boiling brown, the buffer grass bending but holding, the compost rows shining black under their tarps, the swales she had dug by hand, filling and slowing the water, the mobile pens lined like small arcs across the slope. Then she saw the weak place. Water had found a gap between 2 straw bales and was cutting a channel toward the compost. If it reached the windrows and tore them open, everything Denise had warned about would become true. The creek would carry the waste, the county would shut her down, and Earl Haskins would have all the proof he needed. Mara ran to the barn. By the open door sat the last stack of old hay bales her father had cut before he got too sick to climb the tractor. They were gray, stemmy, and useless as feed. Mara had kept them because she could not make herself throw away the final crop he had put up. Now she dragged them into the storm. One by one, she shoved the soaked bales into the gap, stomped them down with both boots, and packed mud against their sides. Water pushed through at first, then slowed, then spread sideways into the grass buffer instead of cutting deeper. Headlights appeared on the road. Buck Tally was the first one to climb out. Roy Mercer followed, in a yellow raincoat that snapped in the wind. They did not call out. They did not apologize. They simply saw Mara knee-deep in water beside the ditch, saw the lower pen trembling against its braces, saw the hay bales holding back the brown cut of runoff, and understood this was not a girl playing at farming. Buck crossed the fence first. Together, in the hammering rain, they shoved the lower pen 6 feet higher. Roy cleared the culvert, while Mara tied down a loosened tarp. Buck stacked the last hay bale against the weak edge of the buffer. None of them spoke, because speech was useless in that weather. But when lightning flashed again, Mara saw their faces clearly. They were not laughing. By midnight, the worst of the storm had passed east. The pasture was scarred with water, but it was still there. The compost windrows had not broken. The ditch ran brown but not black. The mobile pens had held. Inside them, the quail were frightened, wet at the edges, and alive. At dawn, Riley County looked wounded. Low soybean fields lay under water. Gravel had washed from driveways. Hay bales floated against fences. The creek had eaten into banks where grass had been cropped too short and soil lay bare. But behind Mara's barn, the buffer grass still clung to the ground, bent flat and shining. The swales were full, but not broken. The rotated strips had taken water like a sponge compared to the untouched patches. Denise arrived just after sunrise. Buck and Roy were still there, leaning against the fence, wet, silent, and exhausted. Denise walked the drainage line without saying anything. She crouched where the water had nearly cut through and touched the hay bales Mara had packed by hand. This time, nobody needed a report to understand what had happened. The system had not avoided the storm. It had survived it. In the weeks that followed, the story changed slower than gossip usually did. Buck still came into Belle's feed and seed with a toothpick in his mouth, but he stopped making jokes when Mara's name came up. Roy began parking near the Witcom fence, not to watch her fail, but to study where she moved the pens after rain. Len Bell quietly reopened Mara's account with a smaller limit. Egg production climbed as the heat eased. The restaurant doubled its order. The health food shop asked for more cartons. At the farmer's market, customers who once hesitated now arrived early because Mara's quail eggs sold out by noon. She did not get rich quickly, but the farm began to breathe in numbers that mattered. Lower mortality, steadier sales, less odor, better grass, clean compost, and a bank balance that no longer dropped every week like a stone in a well. The next bank payment came due on a Friday. Mara walked into First County Bank wearing the same worn boots she had worn in the barn. Earl Haskins sat behind his desk, the old photograph of him and Daniel still on the shelf near the window. Mara placed the payment on the desk without drama. It was not enough to make the debt disappear, but it was enough to stop the foreclosure process. More importantly, it was proof of income, proof of movement, proof that Witcom Farm had not become dead land waiting to be absorbed by someone bigger. By fall, Denise brought 2 farmers to see Mara's system. They parked by the same fence line where trucks had once slowed to watch the spectacle of her failure. Mara showed them the mobile pens, compost rows, egg room, and pasture map with dates written in careful ink. The birds moved. The manure fed the soil. The compost stayed managed. The eggs paid weekly. The land responded slowly, but honestly. Buck and Roy stood a few steps back from the others. They did not say they had been wrong. They did not need to. Their silence had changed shape. It was no longer judgment, it was respect, trying to learn a new language. By the next spring, the south pasture held enough grass for Mara to bring back a small herd of cattle, not the way her father had done before the drought, but in a tighter rotation behind the birdwork strips. The quail operation stayed small enough to manage and large enough to matter. The barn roof was patched, the vents rebuilt, the egg room inspected, and the compost windrows lined the field like dark, living seams. Mara never became loud. She never stood in the diner and reminded anyone what they had said. She did not have to. The farm did the speaking for her. The sign at the entrance still read, Witcom Farm, though Mara repainted it in the original white and green her father had used. Inside the barn, she hung Daniel's old pasture sketch in a frame made from scrap oak. Beside it, she kept her own notebook, thick with maps, numbers, weather notes, hatch dates, soil observations, and the first profitable months the farm had seen in years. On clear mornings, when fog lifted off the low ground and sunlight spilled over the pasture, the quail stirred in their pens with a soft, living murmur. Grass grew where the county had expected runoff. Compost steamed where neighbors had expected waste. The barn that had been ordered closed stood open to clean air, no longer a symbol of foolishness, but of correction, patience, and stubborn care. She had not saved Witcom Farm by proving people wrong with words. She had saved it by noticing what the land needed, by listening to what had been left behind, and by staying with the work long enough for the smallest creatures on the farm to change the fate of the largest thing she owned. The county had ordered her barn closed. Instead, Mara opened the whole farm back up to life.